Now, one of the ways to help you guys out with deer hunting, deer habitat, deer management is to actually look at what's common and what's commonly held as a belief or even scientific data, and really dispel it and let you know what actually happens in the field. Because what you'll find is, especially in the world of deer hunting, there's a lot of scientific data that's really cool, but it doesn't apply to you. And it's not accurate for you, especially when it comes to small properties, maybe in your public land hunting. And so I want to make sure that we cover not only what works, and what I'm doing around the farm here, what I encourage my clients to do, how I hunt on public land, how I found success in all these areas. But I want to let you know of information that's just plain bad out there as it relates to your hunt, your herd, your management, and your enjoyment of all things whitetail. Because again, there's a lot of misleading data out there, and it's based, really, when it comes to small properties and hunting and how to hunt, it only can be based on experience. And I repeat that, it can only be based on experience. You can't learn how to hunt 4 and 5-year-old bucks in a magazine, in a book. You can learn concepts like I try to teach. You can learn to apply those concepts, but really, you have to get down in the trenches and you have to actually experience this to actually learn and better yourself. You're not going to learn anything about deer management, deer hunting as it relates to a small parcel that you can apply consistently from a classroom. You have to experience this stuff. I heard a deer wildlife biologist manager recently say, "Show me the data." When someone says that and they're in the deer world, that shows that they have a lack of general understanding of deer. Because if you're waiting on data to show what works on small parcels, famed deer research biologist John Ozoga told me years ago, when it comes to small properties and passing studies that would pass, or creating studies that would pass peer review, is impossible. It'd be tens of millions of dollars and dozens of years to really analyze many different parcels and how deer relate to an 80-acre parcel that's being intensely managed, to an 80-acre parcel it's not, or 1,000-acre parcels it's not, versus 40 that is. The variables are just too great. The human factor is too great. So really what it boils down to, if you're waiting for someone to show you the data on this, you're going to be sorely not only incorrect, but far behind. Number one, buck home range. Home range of a mature buck on paper will be about 3 square miles on average. So a pretty big area. What's misleading about that is almost all the studies are done in areas where they can be done. They're not going to be done in patchwork 40, 80, 200, 300 acre parcels of private land. They're actually completed the majority of the time on big public land holdings, corporate land in holdings, and then also big lease properties. So thousands of acres. And what deer do on thousands of acres where you don't have intentionally managed food sources, bedding areas, and locations that actually shrink a deer's movement because of those improvements, because of the quality of the habitat, that 3-mile home range can be very misleading to you. In fact, it can be defeating, because you're looking at like you can't influence a deer herd in any way on a small parcel. But experience, on the other hand, tells you that you can. In fact, what I find is as a buck ages, his daylight home range shrinks over time as he becomes older. Those few spots that have kept him safe from year to year become very defined, and that's where he's at. And on the flip side, a 1.5-year-old buck, who knows where he's going to end up. It's his first set of antlers. He's a yearling buck. He travels 1.5 miles on average to disperse from female social pressure. That's why he leaves his mother. That's why he leaves the herd and he goes and finds his new spot. 1.5 miles on average. So who knows where he's going to end up. On the flip side, a 2-3-year-old buck, who knows where they're going to end up. They're not old enough to be that 4 or 5-year-old buck and have a defined location, so they're moving all over the place. They get kicked around during the rut. Once you have an older age class where you have 4, 5, 6-year-old bucks in the area, those bucks start to really hone in on and define where they're exactly going to be. They become very easy to pattern, very hard to hunt. They're hard to hunt because they're very wary and reactive to hunting pressure. So as long as you let them be in those little spots and you chip away at the outside, which is my strategy, then over time you kill that buck 80% of the time over a 10-year period. Every year you shoot those target bucks. You get those opportunities because you're safely chipping away on the outside of his movement instead of going in for the kill, messing it up one time. There's people who do that. They hunt real aggressive on private land, Missouri, Iowa, Kansas, Kentucky, because you can afford to. There's another buck that'll take that place. There's not a lot of hunting pressure. Bucks die of old age. That's not consistent with the rest of the world. So you're looking at a 200 to 300 yard window of daylight movement for a particular buck. That movement shrinks, and really that large scientific data studies, those big studies that show that 3-mile home range, and over 95% of that's after dark for just about the majority of the entire season outside the rut. And even if you have that movement during the rut, what you'll find is there's a lot shorter and smaller window of daylight mature buck movement when you have highly defined food sources that aren't overpressured, bedding areas that aren't overpressured, and you can maintain that focus on a 40-acre parcel of mature buck the majority of the season during daylight. And you'll find that even during the rut, his activity levels are shrinking because you have everything he needs right there, including seclusion. And things aren't changing like they do on public land where food sources are far and few between and scattered and not very high quality. So really look at that. Experience will tell you that buck daylight movement patterns and movement patterns greatly shrink the older that buck becomes. Census timing. The traditional scientific census timing that some push out there is that you put a corn pile out in August, September and see what your buck population is, your doe population. And folks, that is very, very misleading because on a good property, that'll be the low point of the year. It's a pivot point. Good properties, your population will go up from them, especially as it relates to older bucks. On a poor property, your population will go down at that point. Very few are even, where you have the same habitat, the same herd all year long. That's called an enclosure. It's a fence 10, 12 feet tall all the way around 400 acres. That's where things are consistent on that 400 acres. But if you are like the rest of us, you have 400 acres of free-ranging deer, 200 acres, 40 acres, 10 acres, you're going to find that typically on a great property, the value of your herd and the quality of your herd is only going to increase over time if you're doing a great job. And if you're not, it's going to be going down. So it represents a pivot time. It's not really reflective from year to year. And so you really need to take your census more in October, November, because that's the time of year you can actually influence the herd, influence your hunt, and actually improve the health of the deer with forages and habitat that they need during the fall and winter and that are very short supply. Not to mention, when you're taking this census in general, we're doing that over a mock scrape. No scent, putting a camera on it. It's typically by a stand location. We want to see how many bucks come to that. We've had that on 30 acres of cover, a 40-acre area in Wisconsin that we hunt all the time. We've had 34 bucks hit the same scrape, 32 during daylight. Don't ever believe that bucks only hit scrapes after dark. That's a scientific approach. That's from people putting a camera on a stick in front of a scrape that just turned active in November. Well, they're going to spook most of the bucks to nocturnal when they do that. Our scrapes are up year round. We're not putting scent on it, and our cameras are on those 8-9 months out of the year too. So deer get used to it. There's nothing, we put our cameras up high, we hide them in trees so the deer can't see them. Also, non-infrared cameras, trees wider than the camera itself. So we find ways to make sure that we're getting a census of not only one spot on the property, but every one of our bow stands if we want to hang a camera there. You put corn out, compared to a mock scrape, you have a certain percentage of deer that will not hit that corn pile. And they even have estimations or calculations that'll take into account certain bucks that don't hit your corn pile. How about just put something out that every deer hits in the area, not only bucks, young bucks and old, but does and fawns as well. And that would be a mock scrape. There's nothing else really that you can put out or maintain, including a water hole and certainly a horizontal rub or something like that that's more of a fad, where deer will actually hit consistently the entire year so that you can actually have an accurate census of the ebbs and flows of your population density throughout the entire year, not just the hunting season. And then finally, jawbone aging. Jawbone aging is probably the biggest fallacy when it comes to aging a deer that you can find. It's a way for scientists to look at jawbones, compare them, and make some assumptions of what the age of that buck is. We have a really good chart that was shared by the QDMA long ago. And what's interesting about this chart, I share it with clients all the time, but when you look at this, eyeball versus microscope, but they had 263 deer that were independently tagged as fawns. They knew exactly how old they were. They were up to 8 years old. And what's interesting about that, when you look at the yellow here, that was a jawbone estimation. It's quite clear that the research biologists that were looking at this, there were 5 of them through Texas A&M, but you can tell they must have known that there was an end point to that age because the age estimations went up the last 3 years. It bottomed out in year 6 and then got better at 7 and better in 8.5. But still, even with that being said, people, you'll take these are research biologists. These are at Texas A&M. That's one of the foremost deer research universities in the entire country. This is actually run by Dr. Mickey Hellickson, one of the foremost deer research biologists in the country ever. And then these teeth were also sent into the lab where they look at the teeth and they can count rings, basically estimate the age. And you'll be surprised. We'll just jump forward. Even a 2.5-year-old buck, the lab was only right 70% of the time. And Jawbone Aging was right 78% of the time. Not very good numbers for a 2.5. Let's look to 4.5. Jawbone estimations were the 5 biologists who were estimating these known age deer were right 43% of the time. The lab was right 56% of the time. Pretty bad numbers. So when you shoot a 4-year-old buck, these are deer research biologists who do this for a living. They were even able to use, and if you look at this closely and read it, they were able to use reference manuals and guides to actual aging too. So it wasn't just off the cuff. They were allowed to use resource materials to make a better decision. When you flip to 6.5 years old, let's say you shot a 6.5-year-old, you bring it to someone who's highly experienced, they're going to be right 18% of the time. Let that soak in. 18% of the time on a 6.5-year-old buck. The lab was actually correct 46% of the time, 47 right around there. Why I'm saying this is because in those first 3 to 4 years of age, as you're hunting, we're mostly hunting up to 5-year-old bucks, sometimes a 6-year-old buck, but there's a drastic difference between the antlers of a 1.5-year-old deer, a 2.5, 3.5, 4.5, 5.5, and I can challenge anyone in any area. Once you just simply know what the bucks look like in that area and what type of growth patterns they have, you can easily see if that buck's a 3-year-old versus a 4-year-old versus a 2.5-year-old just based on the antler. That's not total points, that's not total inches, it's just beam diameters, bases, length, overall mass, length of main beams, tine length. There's a combination of it all to where you can actually look at that deer and those antlers a lot higher percentage of the time and say that's a 3-year-old than using a jawbone here and saying that's right 59% of the time or 60% of the time using the Jawbone Aging. I believe you can be a lot more accurate just looking at the antlers. The antlers people don't like to use because they can be all over the chart. You can have a 3.5-year-old buck that's actually a 200-inch animal, and still even then, if it was 4.5 and they were looking at jawbones, they only had a percentage of accuracy of 56% if that buck was 4.5 years old. The best research biologist in the country aging that. So not very good odds when someone looks at your 4.5-year-old 200-inch deer and says that buck was actually 3.5. If they were just an average person judging these and looking at these, they probably had a 40% chance of being correct, and I'm not going to hang my hat on 40% chance. So when it comes to Jawbone Aging, obviously antlers are better. The best is the body size at live on the hoof. The problem with that is a lot of times when you're hunting, you have what I call the 10-second bow hunting rule. You have 10 seconds to identify that buck, know it's a shooter, grab your bow, put your release on the string, hold back, make a good shot. You have less than 10 seconds because then that deer is already gone, and if you're hunting on food plots solely all the time, you're not going to shoot these mature bucks consistently. So real world in the woods, you have to be, obviously you can't look at the jawbone. A lot of times you can't see the body weight. It boils down to knowing your antlers. And the further you get away from knowing those antlers and relying on jawbone, the further you get away from what experience tells you in the field from good hunters is a better call at making a good decision when a deer comes down the line and you know that that is a decent buck because of the antlers. Again, you can't go by points, you can't go by inches, but you can get a great feel for the bucks in your area if you actually try and don't rely on Jawbone Aging as a crutch or even sending your teeth in, because the numbers don't lie. This is a great chart created by the QDMA years ago that I hold on to because this is scientific data right here, but experience tells you otherwise. And I urge you to follow experience when it comes to going to the deer woods and hunting and manage your property, manage your habitat. That'll always guide you. If you're waiting for the data, you can almost laugh at that. You're going to be behind, woefully behind those that are in the field, maybe yourself, in learning about your habitat and your hunt and your deer herd in your local area every day of the year, every hunting season, and those decades that you enjoy being out in the woods for whitetails. Well, I'm real excited, folks. I appreciate you watching this video, but my next web class, How to Plant Food Plots, How to Design Your Food Plot Program, is out. And it really goes through a step-by-step process for not only how to plant your food plots, but why you should plant them, where you should plant them, what you should plant, how you should create them. There's a lot of different modules. Ends up about 30 videos altogether. I urge you to check that out. We're out here completing our food plot work today, and we do that in a pretty strict pattern so we can find success this fall. Food plots shouldn't be a guessing game. Take the guesswork out of food plots and food plots planting, and check out the web classes. I have my How to Design your whitetail property, the food plots for the next web class in the series. And I hope you enjoy it. I hope you check it out. And let me know what you think if you end up purchasing that. And I think you'd be well pleased that you did.